Good. Well, good evening, everyone, and once again, a very warm welcome to a slightly unusual event and one that I think is very timely. As many of you will know, the Insiders Outsiders project, which has been going now for some years, has tended in its online form at least to focus on particular individuals or sometimes groups, but for the most part hasn't stopped, as it were, to take a broader look and deeper look perhaps also at the larger topic of the extraordinary contribution of the refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe, to this country's culture. And lo and behold, just as I was sort of thinking that some months ago, it's happened, and I think this is something we'll return to in our conversation, that actually Owen's book and Burcu's book are actually not the only ones that are tackling this very extraordinary, rich and rewarding subject, and you know, obviously thought-provoking in very particular sorts of ways. So I was delighted that both of you have actually agreed to be in conversation with myself, and we're going to try and keep an eye on the time because I know that there are a whole number of people I happen to know already in the audience who will, I'm sure, want to enter the conversation, and other people besides will be, of course, most welcome to do so. So I think without further ado, let me introduce the two participants in today's informal discussion in conversation event. I'll start with Owen Hatherley, whose book came out at least in English, only in English, prior to Burcu's, which I will come to in a minute. But Owen's book, many of you, I think, have read it, many of you perhaps not, but certainly heard about it. The Alienation Effect is its pointed title, How Central European Emigres Transformed the British 20th Century. And if that's not a bold claim, I don't know what is. Let me just tell you a little bit briefly about Owen himself. He writes regularly on aesthetics and politics for a number of publications, the Architectural Review, Jacobin, the London Review of Books, Sidecar and Tribune. He's the author of a number of books, most recently Walking the Streets, Walking the Projects, and then subtitled Adventures in Social Democracy in New York City and DC. That came out in 2024, and the one I've just mentioned, which obviously is going to be the main focus of our discussion today. He also presents the Intercities podcast for Open City and was the writer and presenter of The Story of Solent City for Radio 4. Right. Burcu, I think, have I got it more or less right? I do hope so this time, more or less. Burcu Dogramaci is Professor of Art History and Director of the Kette Hamburger Research Center called Global Connect, an interesting title, at the Ludwig-Maximilians Universität München. Her research areas are modern and contemporary art with a focus on exile, migration and flight, photography, architecture, textile fashion and indeed live art as well. She was a principal investigator for the European Research Centre funded and supported Consolidator? Yes. Project called Relocating Modernism, Global Metropolises, Modern Art and Exile, otherwise known as MetroMod. And I think she's going to be telling us more about that very wonderful and hugely ambitious project shortly. That took place between 2017 and 2023. And one of that project's outcomes, the one again that is most relevant to our session today, is a book. It exists in print form, but I'm glad to say it's also open access. You can find it online, called London Exile, Metropolis, Modernity and Artistic Migration, published by Leuven University Press this very year, quite recently, but actually has been published in German. German was your original text, was it not? By the Wallstein Press in 2024. Lovely. So without further ado, I'm going to invite first Owen and then Burcu to tell us a little bit about the book. It's their books. It's obvious way to start for those of you particularly who haven't read one or both of them. So I think perhaps over to you, Owen, first. I think you want to screen share, don't you?
Yeah. Let's see if I can get it to work this time. Here we are.
Let's go.
Are we in?
Full screen. All good. Yep.
So I've sort of worried quite a lot of this book that it sort of involves generalizing from an enormous amount of different sort of data and life stories and events, and that you're always going to miss things out if you do that. And now I'm going to try and generalize it into 10 minutes, so to sort of compound the offense. My own sort of background as a writer has usually sort of geographically been between two particular places, which are Britain and Britain's kind of architecture and 20th century culture, and I guess what could broadly be called Central and Eastern Europe, whether you call it Central or Eastern, I think is a sort of matter of politics rather than geography. Um, and 20th century Germany to a degree as well. Um, and so it's always sort of appealed to me as a sort of way of sort of bringing these two particular things together, is to kind of was to sort of try and tell a particular story about migration between around 1933 and 1945. There's a couple of people that come in after, a couple of people that come in before, from Germany, Austria, and I suppose what now gets called the Visegrad countries. Um, in the visual arts only broadly, which meant sort of leaving a lot out, which there was a long process of sort of sifting. Um, and the title, which obviously comes by Brecht, I suppose, was supposed to be a sort of double or triple meaning, referring to the Aliens Act, referring to ideas of defamiliarization in art, but also to the kind of idea of sort of looking at Britain specifically through the eyes of people that had kind of come here, as adults or as adolescents, and saw it through kind of eyes that had been formed elsewhere. So I kind of start the book with a lot of accounts pre-1933, before the Nazi seizure of power, of people from Central Europe who kind of came to Britain one way or another, and were sort of, in many cases, fairly sort of baffled by it, kind of amused by it, sort of saw it as a sort of charming eccentricity in some ways, noted its absence of modern architecture, noted the relative marginality of modern art, enjoyed the relative lack of violence of the police force, tended to like Georgian architecture, tended to be enormously scathing about Victorian architecture, and even more scathing about 20th century English classicism. Enthusiastic about the garden cities, enthusiastic about British industry, and sort of. But I think largely sort of saw it as a country, and this is the thing that kind of runs through the book, that hadn't participated in the aesthetic movements of the early 20th century. That really sort of after the arts and crafts and the sort of Glasgow school and architecture, not a lot had really happened. Certainly the kind of movements around constructivism, the Neue Sachlichkeit, Red Vienna, and the kind of various kind of modern movements in countries like Czechoslovakia. These are things that largely passed Britain by. And this kind of screenshot here is from a series of articles by the German architect Bruno Taut in The Studio, which was one of the most progressive art and design journals at the time, in which he sort of tries to convince British people that they might like modern architecture, very much with the assumption that they haven't seen any. A lot of the book, it sort of tries to tell a political story, I think fairly sort of subtly. I don't want to sort of ram the politics down people's throats. And there are numerous exceptions to the sort of general political strain of the book. But a lot of it is about the way in which this generation of refugees or exiles or emigres, or whatever one wants to call them, had a role in, particularly the post-war welfare state, in the kind of art and culture that went along with it, and the architecture and planning that underpinned it, and not just at the level of sort of city planning, but also in the figures like E.F. Schumacher and his involvement as an economist at the Coal Board, and obviously later his sort of role in influencing hippies. Within that, I also sort of tried as much as possible to broaden out from London. And this isn't really a criticism of centering it on London. It's more sort of, I suppose it's sort of where my curiosity led me. But also, I suppose it's sort of rooted in the way that Picture Post, which, as lots of you will obviously know, is sort of founded by a Hungarian and photographed mostly by Germans and Austrians and a few Hungarians, sets itself this project of sort of going across Britain and sort of documenting it and describing it, not just out of their own sort of curiosity about it, but also sort of describing it to Britain itself, with the assumption that that largely is a country which was fairly sort of undescribed, and particularly sort of urban Britain, particularly kind of industrial Britain. That it was a country sort of presented itself a lot of the time as if it was just of London, Edinburgh, Oxford, and Cambridge, and the countryside, and that kind of picture both generation of photographers. Um, it's sort of interesting for me for sort of going around Britain and trying to sort of document and understand it. Um, Within that, one thing that interested me a great deal in the composition of the book was the role this generation had in creating a certain reified image of Englishness. Um, the example that kind of most sort of amuses me on this, I suppose, is the Corder's Private Life of Henry VIII, and the degree to which the sort of popular image of Henry VIII is sort of almost entirely created by a load of Hungarian filmmakers, and that quite and this sort of continues into sort of things like Powell and Pressburger and Picture Post itself, in Pevsner's lecture series and later book on the Englishness of English art, and obviously the Buildings of England, one of sort of many Penguin Books projects that appears in the book in one way or another. And the Buildings of England, sort of this enormous kind of work of generosity. Generosity is a big kind of theme of the book, really. That is largely, it's a huge part of an Emigrate project. Obviously Pevsner at the helm of it, Rosa Shapira as one of the main researchers, and Schmoller designing them. Often the covers by people like sort of Verhel Volpo and Elizabeth Friedlander. And yet it sort of defines, it's a particular way of sort of seeing England and defining Englishness that in some ways kind of later kind of architects and visual artists kind of push against in some ways, because it sort of in some ways kind of keeps it as somewhere that's a little bit sort of odd and eccentric and somewhat backward. And I think there's a sort of 60s kind of reaction against that sort of Pevsnerism. And it sort of ends with a long discussion of the post-war replanning of Britain, in which I suppose the protagonist, I suppose the hero really, and the book is a book, it is a book that sort of does have heroes to some degree, is Ruth Glass. And really, if this book achieves anything at all, the main thing I want it to achieve is to get Ruth Glass back into print. So Ruth Glass was a Berliner, a sociologist, was one of the most cited people alive for an essay called London Aspects of Change, in which she coins the term gentrification. But her work is enormously sophisticated and enormously kind of prescient. And I think, unlike a lot of sort of urban theory in the 60s, it describes a sort of a country and cities that much more sort of resemble the ones we currently live in than a lot of her contemporaries. Someone who's very, very attuned towards regional inequality, very attuned towards empire and its legacies, and someone that also, I think, above all, sort of, wrote about London beautifully in a sense of it as a sort of totality, as a sort of city entire. A lot of the newcomers, her book about Caribbean migration to Britain, has the obvious stamp of being sort of drawing a lot of its insights from being on London buses and listening to people. But a lot of the kind of figures in that chapter are kind of people whose legacies I think are more mixed. Friedrich Hayek, E.F. Schumacher, Leopold Kohr, the sort of theorist of small country nationalism. But I suppose broadly speaking, it's a book which describes a legacy which I view fairly positively and consider to have made a sort of major sort of internationalizing effect in a country which I sort of fairly insist on this, which I think in the 20s in particular was fairly kind of insular and small-minded in its culture. And not in all cases and at all times, but I suppose there's particular moments in which the Channel becomes something of a war. And I think the 20s was one of those moments. And I kind of feel the sort of breaching of that wall was important, particularly as I feel a similar wall is currently under construction. So I'll stop there. But that's the gist of it. That's the kind of the motivation for it. And that was a very, very rough summary of the contents.
Thank you very much, Owen. That was extremely restrained of you. Sort of keeping to the short brief that I gave you. Thank you very much. I think perhaps we'll go straight on, if we may, to Burcu, because it's tempting. We'll get distracted and we'll run out of time, I think, if we start thinking about what you've said. So let's think of the two projects together, if we may. So Burcu, over to you if you'd like to screen share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. Are you able to see the PowerPoint?
Yes, all good.
Oh, great. Yes, first of all, many thanks for inviting us and for giving us the possibility to launch our books. And dear participants of this online event, very glad that you're here and that you're interested to learn more about the books. And yes, as mentioned before, I like to start with a project which stood at the very beginning of my book. It's the ERC project, Relocating Modernism, Global Metropolises, Modern Art and Exile, and was, as mentioned, based at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich between 2017 and 2023. And the core aim of this project was to research 6 global metropolises as cities of arrival for refugee artists in the first half of the 20th century. And we were a team consisting of Ekaterina Aygün, Laura Karp-Lugo, Helene Roth, Mareike Hetscholdt, Mareike Schwarz, and Rachel Lee. And my thanks goes to this team. And yes, and the project brought together exile, modernity, and urban research, and aimed to decentralize modern art history and to emphasize how migration movements spurred art and its histories. And you see, you're able to see here the first the page of the website. And our project, Metromod, focused on 6 global metropolises: Buenos Aires, New York, London, Istanbul, Bombay, now Mumbai, of course, and Shanghai. And these metropolises were considered as major destinations for European modern artists fleeing their homelands. And the result of this research, and we were interested, no, it's important to emphasize this, how local artists and émigré artists work together, which institutions they built, how they participated in exhibitions, but also how hard their work was leaving their countries and their cities, and started new tasks in this exile cities. And the results of this research were 2 anthologies. You see them here. And they were based on conferences. And the project also produced a website and 6 digital walks. The website's name is metromod.net. And you see here 6 walks through the Metromod cities. And we had also an archive. And the archive entry, you have different possibilities. You enter the archive through a rotating globe, and which rejects a one-sided Eurocentric perspective. You can turn the globe with your cursor, and you can also then you enter either a deck of cards, or you go directly to a map, to a city map, and you have different kind of entries. There are either persons or objects, meaning artworks or books or magazines or events such an exhibition or an opening, and also places or institutions such as publishing houses and galleries. And the entries are always interconnected and linked to underline that cities of exile are often connected by the works and life of émigrés. I myself was not only the head of this Metromod research project, but also responsible for London as a city of exile. And I focused on the work of artists who fled to this capital city in the 1930s and 40s from the European continent. And one result was the mentioned book and why you are here. So you see the German and the English edition of this book. Coming to my book, it combines urban studies, exile research, and art history, and covers various topics in 20 chapters, or more than 20 chapters, ranging from Sigmund Freud's transplanted collection to textile designer Margaret Leichner and the caricatures of Richard Ziegler and Walter Trier for the exile newspaper Die Zeitung. In my book, in London Exile, I examined sculpture, architecture, and the foundings of galleries, of publishing houses and organizations. And I also focus on more, let's say, unusual places such as London Zoo, for which many emigrated artists worked. And I explored the question, for example, why galleries such as the Modern Art Gallery by Jack Bilbo were able to support emigrant artists to such a great extent, because I thought that on one hand there was a general interest in the art of emigrants when emigres founded galleries, but on the other hand there were also no language barriers which helped communicating between the artist and the art dealer. And one starting point of the project was to research addresses, because we followed a city map-based research in which people, their works, and specific events could then be mapped. I was interested, for example, in how far people were from certain places and what it might have meant for them to move around the city. And each chapter of my book, as you see it here, is preceded by a city map showing the most important points discussed in each chapter. And this allows readers to reflect on distance and proximity, and to make it possible to evaluate cumulation in distances, changes of residences and working places, networks and routes through the city. And walking was also fundamental for my own work, for my own aim to experience the historical city from contemporary perspectives. And also measuring distances on foot and capturing the context of places of residences and work. For example, how many steps separated the respective actors in the neighborhoods, how far was it to the underground, which building did a route between home and work pass by, and in which walking distance, for example, lived the writer Max Hermann Neisse from Hyde Park, his preferred environment to spend afternoons and to receive inspirations for his poems. And you see here one of his poem dedicated to the Hyde Park. But I was also interested in neighborhoods where a particularly large number of immigrants lived, such as Hampstead, and you see here Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and Ise Gropius. But I was also interested in cemeteries, for example, the East Finchley Cemetery, where Max Hermann Neisse, the writer you saw, is buried, but also the Golders Green Cemetery in Columbarium, where many emigrants found their final resting places, such as Sigmund Freud, Anna Freud, or the actress Elizabeth Bergner. My question was, for example, what can such final resting places actually tell us about emigrants and their work, who comes together there, who perhaps did not come together in life? This Golders Green Cemetery, for example, leads also to the gallery owner Alfred Flechtheim and the exiled art historian Rosa Shapire. I also took gendered perspectives during my research queer immigrants. I was interested in networks they built, and they helped the networks they helped them to leave Germany, for example. And one example was Kurt Hiller, an exiled writer and queer activist. And he had very strong networks that supported him in emigrating. And in his autobiography, he also writes that, unlike before, he did not engage in sexual relationships with sex workers in London. This means that we have not many sources for following the paths of queer artists in exile. Yeah, I also researched on Anna Freud and her partner Dorothy Burlingham, Tiffany. They also worked in the nursery they founded in Hampstead, and they worked together on war children in German Kriegskinder. Another artist I researched was the sculptor Yusuf Abo, who had really difficulties to conduct his work in exile because he was not able to bring his sculptures and also the materials and the instruments he needed to bring them to London. And it was very hard for him to continue his work. And you see here how that he changed his places of living very often, and he ended with his studio and apartment where the number 6 is. I don't know if you can see it, but not at the center, but far away, because it was a question of money and having the capacities to pay the rent. You see here now also Abo's work, and he had only 2 or 3 commissions, and then stopped working. And another chapter is dedicated to London Zoo as a working place. And this work was connected to Julian Huxley, the brother of the writer Aldous Huxley. And he was the director of the zoo and in close contact to many emigrants, because one of his own aims were how to attract more visitors to the zoo and how to communicate the zoo to others. And this is why he decided to work with the photographer Illa and and with Ludwig Koch, who was a very well-known bioacoustician in Germany and was forced to flee. And they both worked on a book called Animal Language, where they tried to find out how animals communicate and how they speak to each other. And we have on one hand the voices you see here that they were recorded. And on the other hand, you see the photographs following how they spoke to each other and how they react physically to each other. And at the very end, it's very interesting that Ludwig Koch played also the recordings again to the same animals and try to research how they react. And this is another work by Charlotte Wolf, who also worked with Julian Huxley in the zoo and took handprints from primates and from the apes there in the zoo and tried to read their palms, because she read the palms of some of the surrealist artists and writers in Paris before she came to London, and tried to conduct this research, but in cooperation with Julian Huxley. And yes, coming to the end, I also worked on she was mentioned before as a contributor to the Buildings of England. And I worked on this art historian, Rosa Schapire, and her struggle for German Expressionism. She had very close ties to the artists of Die Brücke in Hamburg, where she was particularly interested in Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. And she immigrated from Hamburg to London in 1939, and it was very difficult for her to gain a foothold in London, even though she was multilingual. She worked as a translator, knew Russian, French, and English. And I read her letters, and it was clear that she changed her place of residence frequently in London. And in other words, she had a furnished room and had to keep changing neighborhoods. And I've tried to indicate this on my city map, which also has something to do with the fact that she lived in very precarious circumstances. She constantly had to look for new accommodation that she could afford, and but it was very important for her to live close and in walking distances to libraries and museums. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bodju. If you wouldn't mind, yes, stop screen sharing. Let me make sure that everybody's, hold on, go to the right view so we can see everybody. And I'm going to spotlight the three of us. I have already invited people to start typing in any questions or comments they may have, so please get them coming. Right, hold on. This. So, okay. Hold on, where have I gone? I can't see myself, but that's fine. Good. Well, so many directions in which the conversation might go, but I think even from these very brief presentations, everybody's cannot fail to be aware of the extraordinarily ambitious scope of both your projects. And I suppose an obvious place to start would be, how on earth did you decide what to include, what to focus on, and indeed the corollary of that, what to leave out? Let's start there. Owen, do you want to start the ball rolling, as they say?
Sure. Initially, I wanted to, as you can probably imagine, I wanted to have a lot more in than was in, and um, I suppose there was a certain amount of geographical kind of. I tried to leave out anyone from sort of east of Warsaw, but I broke that rule for two people, for Nam Garbo and for Bertolt. Tried to leave out anyone west of Cologne, but broke that rule for Piet Mondrian. So there was a lot of sort of setting up rules and then breaking them. I tried to keep it as much as possible to things that you could actually go and see. So to buildings, to books. There was lots of time spent in secondhand bookshops in North London, mass market paperback books in particular, to paintings you could go and see in municipal galleries, cities that you could visit, films that you could see, which the thing I kind of the two kind of aspects I most regretted leaving out were music and I guess kind of applied arts in terms of things like textiles, ceramics, and so forth. And I've sort of trying to chivvy the publisher to let me kind of put an appendix in the paperback to kind of talk about some of those things. So the first thing was the sort of rule of like no scientists, and that was the sort of first like that sort of first made my life easier. No scientists, no Russians was the sort of watchword. But then sort of became very, very tricky, and and it continues to be. I subscribe to the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, and the project has obviously been enormously helpful to me in the years I've been writing it. And practically every time there's a new video, I'm like, oh, there's someone I left out. There's a few people that are left out semi-deliberately, but most of them it's pure accident. Reading Burcu's book a few weeks ago, there were quite a few sort of not so much kind of people that had been left out, but often kind of aspects of their work that I either downplayed or didn't know about, and which was both kind of fascinating and also deeply frustrating. There was quite a lot, particularly with John Hartfield, actually, where I feel that I massively understated the significance of the work they were doing in Britain. So it's kind of a thing that I could end up sort of updating until for the next few decades, I imagine.
I feel exactly the same about the Insiders Outsiders anthology, which now goes back to 2019. Absolutely, I completely understand. Bodju, over to you. What are your thoughts about my question?
Yes, I think writing this book meant constantly having to make decisions about what to leave out and what to include, and it would never have been possible to include all the artists and intellectuals, of course, who immigrated to London. And also there was a huge amount of research before. I think I stood really on the shoulder of giants, let's say, when I name all, I can't name all of the very important authors who contributed to the topics like Shulamit Bear, Jutta Vincent, of course, and Sarah McDougall, Rachel Dixon, Anna Newberg, and yourself, Monica, of course. And so it was not easy for me to find my own way through the materials. But to say it was important not to write individual biographies, but to argue on the basis of topics such as the significance of different artistic techniques for artistic arrival in the countries of exile, in the country of exile, and especially in London, and the founding of institutions, of networking, the importance of the city for creative work, and the mark left by the emigrants on the urban fabric, so to say. And it was also very important for me not only to focus on already well-known figures, but also maybe on artists who were not as much on focus, such as others. And yeah, this is why I decided for one artist or for another, or for one event and against another.
Fair enough. And it's interesting when obviously, London is your avowed focus in your book. London is clearly central to what Owen's covering as well. And even you choose to go to Leicester, as it were, metaphorically. But, there are obviously these important outlying areas which Owen covers in more detail. Perhaps we can come back to London later on. Can I ask you, and I'm sure there will be some questions coming in, terminology. I wonder how much you thought carefully about the titles, because I'm very struck that in both, well, you use different words. I mean, Roger, you use the term exile, which to me, and I think most people would agree, suggests a yearning for the land you have left. And of course, for very obvious historical reasons, most of the predominantly Jewish refugees who came, not just here, of course, but also to America ultimately, would never have wanted to go back, to put it absolutely bluntly. So I think, exile is a tricky word. I'm sure you're aware of that. And similarly, emigres, I mean, it's a word that obviously Daniel Snowman, who you should have mentioned, Burcu, as another sort of major, figure in sort of setting the scene with his book on the Hitler emigres. But, even he, I mean, he uses that term, which once more doesn't suggest that absolutely crucial element of, as you've just said, forced to flee. Refugié, yeah, the refugee. Now, of course, I understand refugees do not remain refugees all their lives, or even necessarily, hopefully, for too long. And yet, I just wonder whether you might give us your thoughts about the different terms and whether you had any sort of sense of unease, perhaps in plumping on the one hand for exile and the other for emigres.
Should I start? Maybe.
Please do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think terminology is very important for my work, and I'm very much aware that the meaning of some of these terms are maybe used in German are completely different. When I think of emigration, which is often used synonymously to exile, emigration means, for example, in the US-American context, something really different. And it was really hard to translate this in the English version, because we have this emigrant and immigrant, but I think the aspect that it was a forced migration was very important for me, and it was also important to listen to the emigres themselves, how they called themselves. Else Meitner used this refugee that you mentioned, using a historical French term for a first escape and putting herself into another history. I think this is very important. And there were other terms of self-description, such as refugee, exile, emigre, continental Jew, German Jew, for example. And I think it's very important to consider these names and to think about them through the perspectives of the emigres themselves.
Indeed. Owen.
But for me, I suppose emigre was a sort of, I sort of felt was the least bad available, but they all presented problems. And refugees didn't work for me because of the fact that a few of the people involved came at a point when they weren't, like the Corders or Goldfinger. 5 years later, they would have been refugees, but when they arrived in Britain, they were not. So that was the sort of sense of it. It didn't entirely, and some of the people at the very tail end of the book, like Jan Schichold, who came over from Switzerland. He was a refugee to Switzerland, but not to Britain. And there was, emigre just seemed one of the less loaded terms that I could have used. But the title went through various iterations, but the one word that was always in it in some way or another was alien. In terms of things like the Aliens Act of 1905 or 1906, in terms of the way these people were described in the 1930s, in terms of internment and the so-called internment of enemy aliens, and also the kind of particular sort of way sort of filtered through Braxton. I was kind of trying to kind of look at a lot of their work. So that was always in. but they wouldn't let me call the book what I originally wanted to call it, which was The Aliens in the Britain They Made, because they said that many of the readers will assume it's about extraterrestrials, which alas. So it ended up having emigres in it as well to kind of make clear who it was actually about. Yeah, it was.
As you say,
Was
there's no term that actually says everything, and yes, I
mm,
understand the choices you had to make. I mean, one should of course add to that even those, and I think this is quite important just to think about, that even those who didn't come, strictly speaking, as refugees at the time they came, they couldn't go back when push came to shove, to put it bluntly. So I think, there's that also to be aware of. Indeed, indeed. Right. Another question, all obviously related. There is, I think, a temptation, and I was struck, Owen, that you used the term insufferably English several times in your book, which couldn't help, it sort of made me chuckle slightly. But the kind of temptation to establish a kind of over polarization, if you like, between, on the one hand, what is often seen, and to some extent rightly, that England was insular, provincial, ignorant about continental avant-garde developments, inward turned, hostile to aliens, etc., versus the idea of the incomers being cosmopolitan, internationalist, adherents of modernism, etc. And I just wonder whether both of you would like to comment on that. Again,
sure. I mean,
oh,
yeah.
okay.
I suppose for me, I suppose I was kind of quite keen at this outset of the book to make clear that this was a version of the story rather than anything definitive. And I think, although I sort of try and acknowledge that there were sort of traditionalist and classicist artists in the emigration, that they don't play as big a role in my book as they might. But one reason for beginning the book with kind of both pre and post 1933 accounts from immigrants and refugees was how commonplace that sentiment was. And sometimes, it's played up for comedy later on. Think of the accounts of sort of British art and sort of seeing British art for the first time in Federalman's Making of an Englishman, which I think he's kind of burlesquing it to a degree by that point. But there's, I think, the sense of sort of ridicule is pretty clear. I suppose so at that point, I kind of insist on it. I insist on it in the 30s. I insist on that divide. But I think what happens subsequently makes that divide a great deal less clear.
Mm.
That sort of, and it's a country that, because of a lot of things, it has a sort of, its intelligentsia becomes significantly less kind of ignorant about the rest of the world over the course of the 30s. Politically, for very obvious reasons, there's much more engagement with what's happening in Europe. And, a lot of the sort of Englishness thing for me, I suppose, is also about the way in which cliches of Englishness, I suppose I was trying to say earlier, cliches of Englishness are sort of produced by this generation of immigrants. The enormous immigrant contribution, something like the Festival of Britain, which describes at length in the Insiders Outsiders anthology, is very much a case in point. That this kind of enormous sort of celebration of Englishness is sort of done in enormous part by Germans and Austrians and Czechoslovaks and Poles, and that is the thing that I kind of, that becomes much more of a sort of dialogue and back and forth, I think, from the late 30s onwards. But circa 1933, with a couple of exceptions, typographers in particular, I think there is a very large divide. And for various reasons, I wanted to kind of keep that there rather than downplay it.
And yet, I suppose one has to qualify that to some extent by pointing out that there were individuals, small in number, but really significant. Herbert Reed keeps cropping up, does he not, in both your books? Julian Huxley in the zoo context, fascinating character. There are these enlightened individuals who are very much attuned to what's going on abroad and are actively welcoming and supportive of the refugees. And I suppose the other point that needs to be made crystal clear, which I think is implicit in both your books, although not always explicit, is that, and it's obvious it's to do with language and culture, that actually Britain was never, in very, very few cases, the destination of choice, that most of them would have preferred, and indeed did prefer, to go to Prague, for example. Yes, much more culturally close to what they knew, perhaps to Paris, because Paris had other obvious attractions, and it was only because of force of circumstances they ended up in this this sceptred isle. So it's that partly accounts for this sense of complete strangeness that you quite rightly commented on, Owen. Anyway, I mustn't go on. Burcu, over to you. What are your thoughts about that polarization, that
Yeah,
dichotomy?
I would agree that that London as a city of artistic modernism and artistic exile is not a black and white story that tells
No.
about the avant-garde only coming to the city through exile. And London was surely not a terra incognita. There were artists you mentioned, and also critics, writers, Herbert Reed, Barbara Hepworth, Henry Moore, for example, in Circle, and in close connection to they worked in close connection to artists coming to London. But I have to say at the same time that I found many galleries that were founded by immigrants, such as St. George's Gallery, Hanover Gallery, Marlborough Fine Art, Storen Gallery, Modern Art Gallery, and they promoted continental modernism, the art of immigrant artists, and also contemporary art. And I think in this respect, they were really important, and gave a special input from immigration. Yeah,
No question about it. I mean, I think there are
yeah.
a lot of people now delving further into the gallerists' contribution, but even there, one has to kind of perhaps take a more nuanced view. So, for example, Flechtheim, who's a major figure who I think crops up certainly in your book, he already had prior contacts with the Mayer Gallery, which was not run by refugees or indeed by Jews, as far as I'm aware. So, there are, yes. It's as you say, it has to be definitely not black and white, a much more nuanced portrait that one tries to paint of the whole situation. Indeed, I have a question. I don't know whether you can see it for yourselves, from John Hillary, and I'm waiting for some other people to. Surely there must be questions. Both fascinating. Many thanks. He says, did either of you find any appreciable difference in the cultural reception experienced by the German/Stroke Austrian, i.e., German-speaking emigres in Britain, as opposed to those from further east? And I know, Owen, you said you tended to try and avoid anything east of Warsaw, but of course there were many trajectories, and I think you both touched on the fact that, the paths were never simple. Often the individuals had to go from place to place. It wasn't just a straight path at all. But I wonder if you'd like to tackle that question.
Yeah, they're all quite different groups, and I think I sort of want to bring them in because there's so many people. Someone like Marcel Breuer is a great example. You know, would you put them in there as Hungarian, put them in there as German? There's a lot of there's in the kind of avant-garde, and a lot of the book does focus on the avant-garde. There was already an enormous amount of sort of movement before 1933, and a lot of political events. So, like the Hungarians, most of the Hungarians in the book, most of whom were Jewish, had left in 1919 with the suppression of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, gone from there to Austria or to Germany, and so lots of them are sort of refugees sort of 3 or 4 times over. But they then are quite interested in sort of stressing out Hungarians. There's the line in the second of George Mikish's books about Englishness, How to Be Inimitable, where he has a chapter called Everyone is Hungarian. And there is a sense in which, particularly cinema, but sort of a huge swathe of the British culture, this particularly Hungarian, usually Hungarian Jewish presence that is very invested in certain Hungarians rather than Germans. The Poles are almost a category of their own, and I am denied about leaving Poles out. But certain figures, I think, again, like the Marcel Breuer problem, someone like Yankel Adler, I was kind of like, it seemed silly to me to leave him out. And once I'd brought him in, it made sense to bring in Josef Herman. If you had Herman, it made sense to bring in the Polish architects who came over, who were a very major group. And they often, particularly the kind of immigrants that come over during the war as part of the army, so they have a quite different reception, and they quite, sort of devote themselves to kind of creating this in some ways quite sort of how to put it, sort of it's like antediluvian kind of Polish Catholic kind of culture, and sort of incubating it in Britain as an alternative to the sort of communist culture in Poland at the time. So there's all sorts of sort of different. And Czechs and Slovaks are another issue, and I think I think the Hungarians and Poles are slightly different in many cases, whether they're Jewish or not, because I think they have a much greater sort of insistence on their Hungarianness and their Polishness. And I think that's sort of received as such, rather than sort of being sort of generic Central European migrants, that they're sort of seen as Hungarians and Poles and prefer to be seen as Hungarians and Poles.
Despite the
So,
fact that many of them came via Berlin or wherever, sort of en route to this country.
yeah.
Burcu, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the same. I think many of when we say of the people coming from how would say far east, well, how it was mentioned. So here is coming from further east. Many of them also under Krashna Kraus, who founded the Focal Press publishing house, but also Stefan Loren, they came from Hungary to Berlin and Munich, and then came to London. And I think this is very important. Also, John Hartfield living for quite a few years, a few years in Prague, and I think maybe, and also Rosa Shapire. I mentioned her. She was born what we now know as Ukraine, and in Galicia, and then she came to Hamburg with her family, and then came to London. And I think this was a multi-migration, I think, and this is very important when we think of these exiles, for example, mentioned in my book. Yes, and there was also this Polish community. Rosa Shapire mentioned that she lived for quite a while in a room in a neighborhood where many people from Poland lived, and it was very good for her to speak again the language. She was capable of speaking Polish and Russian and German, and I think this, yeah, I think this needs maybe more research to do more research on the different communities gathering in London.
No, I think that's absolutely right. You mentioned Owen, the Catholic Poles, which is obviously a very different group to the Jewish
Mhm.
Poles. And, one might think, for example, of Joseph Herman, who I happen to know, actually met, I knew him quite well, I've written about him, but, he actually left Warsaw in 1938 because of Polish anti-Semitism. So
Mhm.
let's not forget that again, further complicates the already very complicated picture. Okay, we have a
Absolutely.
few, sorry, go on.
No, I think that's true. Although I was sort of struck by how much one of the people that I sort of left out of the book and sort of rather regretted it was Yasha Reisha.
Hmm.
And I was talking to Yasha about this a few months ago, and she was very much, I shouldn't have been in because I was far too young, which I thought got me out of it. But she, I think, was sort of very interested in, in a sort of general sort of Polishness, despite, not at all being a sort of Catholic Pole. Um, and, sort of people, a lot of the sort of artists who were much attached to that kind of nationalistic idea of Polishness, I found them having more connection with Jewish Poles than I had expected,
Hmm.
particularly given the enormous anti-Semitism of the Polish regime and the Polish society in the late 30s. So, yeah, I think there was, and in some cases, I feel people sort of took a pick of an identity from various that were on offer in the 40s and 50s in particular.
You
And
could
and,
extend,
and
sorry, go
sorry,
on.
go on.
No, I was just thinking you could extend what you've just said about the Poles to the German speakers, that actually, despite everything that had happened, there was still this, in certain quarters anyway, some of course did choose to go back, particularly if they were communists, but even if they didn't and they made their lives in this country, there's still a certain, maybe a kind of yearning for the world of their childhood, which of course had been completely, sort of blotted out. But it's very complicated, isn't it? But these issues of identity and where you fit remain fascinating. Um, Right. I've got a comment here from Anna Nyberg, who's already been mentioned, very much an expert on both the designers, the emigre designers, but also the emigre publishers. Um, uh, Kind of sort of just reinforcing what we were touching on earlier on modernism and the refugees, it's also important to point out that not all the refugees were modernists. The German Helmut Weissenborn, not in fact Jewish, I think I'm right in saying, who made a career as a printmaker, illustrator, and teacher, hated modern art and abstract art and was most unspoken on the subject. And indeed, there are quite a few much more traditional, even one might say academic artists, many who came later in career, which I think is, the age at which you come is obviously completely crucial, isn't it, in any refugee situation. So that's that's obviously an important point to be aware of. We tend, don't we, to focus on those who are more obviously avant-garde. And then from Carolyn Kornbluth, in fact, Anna, I don't know whether you want to enter the conversation. What about booksellers and publishers in London? I believe they also made an impact, but perhaps the two of you might like to say something about that first.
Okay, I suppose and sort of linked. My answer, I suppose, kind of connects to both questions really. I'm glad to have a question from Anna. His book I found enormously interesting and useful. But that's very true, and I think the particular area where I most discuss it, and there's places where I sort of acknowledge it and places where I downplay it, but the place where it was most unavoidable is typography. Which I think is also the area where a lot of emigres were interested in British work that was happening. People like Schickhold, Volper, I think, had a respect for the sort of traditionalist British printing of the 1910s and 20s around people like Edward Johnston and Oliver Simon. And I think the links there were much stronger, and there was much more of a sort of, there's a trajectory of people who, in certain respects, were sort of modernists or had been modernists, kind of veering towards a very quite traditional classical sense of the book and of book design in the 40s and 50s, with major kind of emigre influence within that. Obviously, sort of people who are famous like Schickhold and Volper, people who are not so famous like Schmoller and Elizabeth Friedlander. So yeah, I suppose that's the place where I'm most engaged with classicism of a lot of these people. But yeah, there's other elements where I downplay it a bit, and that obviously connects to the publisher's question because I suppose I talk a lot through Penguin about Penguin Books, which is about the enormous kind of what could we even say plagiarism of a lot of German publishing, German and Austrian publishing that Penguin indulge in. They're obviously not founded by emigres, but there's a lot in the book about Thames and Hudson and Phaidon, Focal Press, and Burcu also writes about these quite extensively, particularly Focal Press.
Yes, of course. Publishing houses, they're very important. I think Anna Nieburg is here. She could tell us about it quite well. And yeah, I was very interested in publishing houses, but especially how they were connected to authors, to artists, and how they give them floor to publish and to be more visible. And also figures such as Ernst Gombrich and Grete Ring and many others were connected to these publishing houses, and Focal Press, of course, was very important as a publishing house specialized on photography and on guidebooks. And there were many photographers, such as Wolf Suschitzky, for example, who were really affiliated to these different publishing houses. And there were others not founded by emigres, such as Lindsay Drummond, but very important for them. Owen, you mentioned John Hartfield, and he was the artist who designed many of the covers for Lindsay Drummond. Yeah.
Now, I must confess, I hadn't realised quite how active he was in that department. As you say, it counters the traditional image of England being totally unreceptive to the radicalism of John Hartfield. So yes, that's a very interesting sort of just one story among many. Right, Rachel Dixon from the Ben-Uri is pointing out quite rightly that in 2017, the Ben-Uri mounted an exhibition called Art Out of the Bloodlands, a pointed title, presented works by both Polish Jewish artists who survived the Holocaust, which we haven't dwelt on, but of course it forms the dark backdrop to almost everything we've been talking about today, and the Polish Catholic artists who arrived with the Polish army in 1940 and later with the Anders army. So yes, that's a really interesting project. I'm looking at the time, and we won't finish just yet because I think there's still so much to be said, but could we perhaps just dwell for a little while at least on the issue of gender, because Owen, it's not something you kind of grapple with head on, and yet you've said of all the many heroes or indeed heroines you might have singled out Ruth Glass, who of course is a woman. And I just wonder, I mean, we've seen from Burcu's presentation, she has one chapter specifically on that issue, and many women crop up in the course of your book, and indeed also particularly in architecture. I was interested, Owen, how many of the figures, less known architects, were actually women. It was quite a discovery for me, but I wonder if you'd both like to, sort of by way of beginning to conclude, talk a little bit about the issue of gender.
Yeah, I suppose it's not a thing I sort of explicitly talk about. You're right, but there are um, photographers and architects were where where I noticed that there was most kind of presence of women, and in terms of photographers, it's sort of quite striking how a lot of the people involved they don't kind of go on to make sort of long careers like people like Bill Brandt, that someone like people who are very much easily as talented like Edith Tudor Hart for various kind of political and personal reasons, but I think gender is definitely part of it. Don't end up having sort of enormous splashy exhibitions about them in the 1980s, and don't sort of but even, there's some exceptions even within that. But yes, photographers was a major area. And architects is an interesting one because the place where I saw that the most was in local authority architect departments, and particularly with Poles. Um, so people like Elena Moffat, who was an architect at the LCC and the GLC, some of whose buildings in the East End of London are currently threatened with demolition. Magda Borowiecka, who designed the famous barrier block down the road from where I am right now in Brixton. Um, and they tended not to be the people with sort of their name in a practice. There's if I think of like the 20th century architect series that the 20th century society put out, so far there isn't a single woman named in any of the names of any of those practices. Um, and I think that's largely because they're in the local authorities, then particularly in London, particularly in Lambeth and the LCC. Um, so they're kind of there and they're working away, and a lot of the work is on a very large scale. But there's a sort of almost a similarity between there and a lot of kind of architecture in at the time in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, which has an enormous female presence, but never as the name at the top of the fur. And never with the sort of the sort of most prestigious project. So there's this kind of curious thing where sort of there's more accessibility, I guess, at the middle layer of the profession, and the top layer is still at that point kept firmly closed. So it was quite a complicated one, but yeah, that and housing in particular, there's a major presence of women and women immigrants who later become prominent in the 50s and 60s.
Mm. What are your thoughts about that thorny issue?
Yes, yeah, I think it's still a problem. Female artists are still less frequently written about and were less present in exhibitions and the art world. And in addition, I think some of them had to take on other jobs, such as maids, in order to support their families. And in my research in general, I'm very interested in how structural discrimination, in this case coming with exile, affects reception. And in my chapter, Gendered London, I also look at issues such as the debates on social class within which women as mothers and caregivers I think, were really important. For example, Edith Tudor Hart, who worked on a photographer on social issues, and she contributed to Marjorie Spring Rice's study on working class wives. And I think this is very important to see not gender not as something connected to female artists, for example, but also connected to specific topics, which are maybe partly brought in with emigration.
No, indeed. And I was interested, Owen, I think on your cover, you show it's a portrait of Bill Brandt, who everybody knows, although he denied vehemently ever coming from Germany, but it's by Lelia Goer, who's a very interesting character. And in fact, the whole family, and we did a Insiders Outsiders event some years ago now on that. Edith Tudor Hart, as some of you may know, is suddenly, everywhere. There are many books that have just come out, exhibitions. There's another biography in the pipeline coming out next year. So things are changing. And in fact, you may not be aware, there was actually an exhibition held at Four Corners Photography Gallery in East London at Bethnal Green called Another Eye, and it was subtitled Jewish Emigre Women Photographers in Britain since 1933. So what it was all about was quite explicit in its own particular way. Very interesting project. There is a sort of online a modest catalogue. So that's a very rich, as you say, photography is a rich terrain as well as architecture. Okay, last chance in the audience if anybody has anything they'd like to say. It is drawing late. I mean, maybe we could just bring things to a conclusion with another thought. I mean, no one could go on so much longer, but obviously, Owen, you are British born, presumably, certainly London based, Brixton based, by the sound of it.
Camberwell,
You are coming to it from a very
Camberwell based.
Londoner's perspective, and with no personal, as far as I'm aware, no personal links to this extraordinary, complicated, and difficult history. But I hope you won't mind. I mean, your name is presumably Turkish, yes, but you've lived in Germany for many years. Your German is clearly, impeccable. You're coming from very, very different places and backgrounds and contexts. And I just wonder whether you'd like to say, perhaps sort of focusing on the way the two books have been received. Your book, Burcu, came out first in Germany, obviously. It's now has just come out in English. Oh, and I don't know if there are any plans to translate your book, but it would be quite just interesting to think about the way the books themselves have been received in the different contexts.
Yeah, I mean it's likely been positive. There was one negative review which made some points that were fair and some that I thought were unfair. It claimed that I didn't cite a load of people that I did cite, which I thought was not really cricket. But that aside, it seems to have been, I suppose, and I think one reason for that, I suppose, partly, there's already an enormous amount of groundwork has been laid. And so, it was a thing that people were sort of already talking about to a degree. And I think, without wanting to sort of labour the point, I do think leaving the European Union has meant that, people are sort of very, very attuned to, ways in which Britain can suddenly become a very hostile environment to people from elsewhere. And that I didn't want to kind of make it explicit in the book, but it does sort of run through it to one degree or another, particularly in the discussion of internment. So yeah, I would really love it to be translated, and there's a few places, particularly Hungary, actually, where I'd be very interested to know what they made of it, because the book is absolutely full of Hungarians, but they are not generally people that are particularly celebrated in Hungary for various political reasons that are somewhat dubious. And I suppose, yeah, I sort of there's an element of it sort of wanting to, hopefully, I mean, it would have to go through translation for this to happen, but I would very much like it to be read in a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. Partly because also so many of the people in it are people that have, sort of go across borders fairly routinely, even before it becomes a sort of forcible issue in 1933, that it's full of people that, that can't be sort of tied down nationally. And that's we're in a period of sort of national tying down, I think. So I don't know, I think it might be a factor in its reception or otherwise.
No, alas, you're, I think, completely right there. On the question of music, I don't know whether you're aware, there's a wonderful project initiated by Norbert Mein at the Royal College of Music. It's now called, it morphed from Singing a Song in a Foreign Land, which is a lovely poetic title to the rather more mundane music migration and mobility. But they have a wonderful website comprising interviews both with the composers and musicians who came to these shores, but also those who worked with them. So again, that sense of fertile interaction. And, it's very much, as you say, the kind of transcending of boundaries and the kind of argument that actually this is the way it should be, that actually, yes, anyway, I don't need to plug that point, I think, for the assembled audience, but it does also bring up the timeliness of your projects. And indeed also the fact, I think I was mentioning this to you in informal conversation before, that actually, although your two books are the most ambitious of the ones coming out recently, we've got Andy Friend's new book on the Artists International Association. We've got Harriet Atkinson's book on exhibitions as propaganda, anti-fascist propaganda projects from the 30s through to the Festival of Britain. In fact, I think is where she stopped. So there is, there's a kind of real moment here, isn't there, of, I was going to say jumping on the bandwagon, that's very cynical. I think it's not. It's much more than that. It's much deeper than that. But, a sort of sense that this is actually a crucial topic for the present day. Sorry, Burcu, I'm stealing the thunder there. You tell me your thoughts about your book its reception in Germany and now here?
Yeah, maybe to say something on the reception in Germany, I think the contexts are very important. We had this Bauhaus anniversary, the Bauhaus Dessau, in this year, and I think there's really again an interest in the old Bauhaus figures such as Gropius and Breuer and Moholy-Nagy, but also other artists such as Otti Berger are again in the middle of interest, and I think I mentioned her only very briefly in my book, but there is an interest also in Otti Berger, but also in Charlotte Wolf. I think there is another awareness of you, and you mentioned it on female intellectuals and female artists, and I think this is why people may be interested in my book, because the context, bringing them into the community of emigres placed in London. I think it's really interesting because, for example, Otti Berger was only for a very short time in London, and people are more aware of her time at the Bauhaus, and maybe and also prior to emigration, the time before immigration. And so I think it's very interesting for them maybe to read more on her, and also on Margaret Leichner. She's not really really well known, I think, in Germany, but maybe better here in London and also in England. So yeah, this is I think why I said that the context of reception is really important.
Can I just chip in with one thing,
Yes,
Monica?
of course you can.
I just wanted to say to Owen, because he mentioned the idea of Hungary, that I made a film with a colleague about refugee designers, textile designers, graphic designers, and so on, and showed it in various places, Vienna and so on. We also showed it in Budapest because one of the designers in the film was Tibor Reich, who was quite a very successful textile designer and manufacturer in Britain. And we were treated very politely, and we had a screening at a big art college, big textile, they did textiles. But some of the comments were very, very off color, and they said things like, yes, but they shouldn't have gone. They should have stayed here. I mean, absolutely incredible, whether it's based on ignorance or I don't know. We just had a very uncomfortable feeling. It was very right-wing place, and very anti-foreigner. And I don't think it would be a good time. I can't imagine the book being received with open arms in Hungary at the moment.
I mean, that's kind of very much what interests me in a way, is I feel that's very much the impression I've got from when I've been there myself. So I'm kind of curious to sort of poke that, really. I did get an invitation to talk to people at the Hungarian embassy, which I've got next week. So God knows what that's going to be like. We'll see.
Oh, I should think that would be better. Yes, that's interesting. Also, very naughtily of me, Monica, taking the limelight here, but I wanted to flag up, because we talked a lot about publishers, and we have a new boy on the blog who's Marcus Lever, who has just finished his MA on Paul Hamlin and is embarking on a PhD on other emigre publishers. And he is a publisher himself, and he has a very interesting approach. It's not, it's also about the emigres as, what did he call them? Publishers of the entrepreneurs of the imagination.
Nice.
Yes. Anyway, he is a forthcoming attraction.
I was going to mention it. You beat me to it there. Absolutely. Some comments from Carolyn, I think particularly actually just apropos the Hungarians. Tibor Reich was a family friend, and he was so very Hungarian, at least in the British context. And in fairness, actually, I mean, there is a book, I don't know if you know the book by Robert Waterhouse, specifically about the Hungarians. It's a real potpourri of interesting things to follow up. And actually, I was in conversation some while ago now with the Hungarian Institute here in London about an exhibition based on his book, and I sort of half thinking it's time to revisit that idea, but, many more projects possibly in the pipeline. Very good. I think maybe we should stop. There's been a slight diminishing of numbers. It's probably time for supper. But and last chance, anybody?
Monica, I don't know why nobody's mentioned, well, not nobody, but Owen hasn't mentioned your mother.
Oh, listen, there are many people who won't mention. Come on.
No, but I think somebody had to speak up. I think she was a refugee, she was a woman photographer, and she's very important. And I didn't want the evening to pass without
Well,
mentioning.
thank you, Vera. Thank you very much. But the fact is, many, many
Of
wonderful,
course,
creative
of
individuals have
course.
not been mentioned. But, you know, thank
No.
you.
But thank you for mentioning her. Really, really important.
Well, yeah, she's the reason, or one of the reasons I embarked on the Insiders Outsiders project. And interestingly enough, she didn't see herself, she never thought of herself, she said, retrospectively, as a refugee. She came as a girl of 14. Interesting. Okay, let's leave it there, I think. I would like, though, just to conclude, if I may. I mean, Anna has kindly already mentioned the Marcus Lever talk, but if you're interested in knowing more about what Insiders Outsiders gets up to, as I say, mostly focusing on individuals rather than these broader overarching topics, which of course underpin everything we do. If I can just run through very quickly what we have in store. This is our last event before the Christmas break, as they call it. But on the 19th of January, we indeed have Marcus Lever talking about Paul Hamlin, the publisher. On the 29th, I've just secured the interest of the niece of the wonderful graphic designer and Holocaust survivor, not somebody who came in time, but after the worst, Romek Marba, who worked extensively for the Penguin Crime series, in conversation with Naomi Games, the daughter of Abram Games. That should be fascinating. It's going to coincide with Holocaust Memorial Day, more or less. On the 9th of February, actually, Owen, you'll be interested to hear, we are going to have a talk about Ella Briggs, who is another female architect, barely known. I'd never heard of her. I mean, you know, it really does bring home how much there is still to find out. But actually, there's a new book. I don't know whether you're aware of it. There's a new book that's just come out about her called Finding Ella Briggs, The Life and Work of an Unconventional Architect. So that's on the 9th of February. We've then got on the 16th, we have a member of the Cassira family. The Cassira, I think Anna will bear this out, a family that crops up in so many different contexts. It should be absolutely fascinating. She'll be talking from quite a personal perspective about the extraordinary family that the Cassiras were, the Cassiras and their circles. And last but not least, Anna, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, the early New Year program is going to conclude with Anna talking about her, what will be imminent book coming out, I think it's at the 12th of March, on the history of Thames and Hudson, which of course, when it comes to art publishing, together with Phaidon, absolutely pivotal and still very much alive and well to
Just
celebrate.
correct you slightly. It's actually their book, Monica. I've just
Oh,
written
come
all
on, you've
part
really
of it.
worked out.
It's a huge, huge book. I just wrote three little.
It's a celebration of their 75th anniversary, but Anna has played an important role, even if she doesn't admit it herself. Lovely, and thank you so much. And if you want to be kept abreast of future events, and there will be, I can assure you, some many in the new year, if you want to go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website, go down to the very bottom right of each page, the homepage will do, and sign up to receive the newsletter. It's slightly sporadic, but it does keep on coming. You will find out about events in the future. So thank you very much, Carolyn. It's nice to see you. Thank you for your contributions, Vera. Likewise. And most of all, of course, thank you, Owen. Thank you, Burcu, very, very much. And if you haven't read the books, they're big, they're dense, they're absolutely fascinating. Please go away and do so. All right. Good night, everyone, and all the very best. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you again.